want to welcome listeners. We got Glenn Kinney, uh, old friend of mine, critic, uh, just critic at large of everything. For those of you who have a good memory, we remember him from the fabled, long gone, sadly, Premiere magazine, where I first got to know him. But since then, he's become a very renowned film author and should pick up his definitive book on Goodfellas, Made Men, one of the uh, getting one of the greatest on one of the greatest movies of all time, which leads us into what we're here to discuss, is a couple of Scorsese films, because of that book and other projects, Glenn has become kind of one of the leading Scorsese aficionado scholars. So, Glenn, long time no see. Glad to
Good
get
to
you
see
to talk
you.
about it. Yeah,
Good to see you. Always great to speak to you, Aaron.
right.
Thank you for the endorsement. The book is Made Men, the story of
And
Goodfellas. It's Hanover Square Press.
right.
Uh,
Yes. And I will say this about the book is that I usually avoid, especially of like my all-time favorite movies, I usually avoid kind of these books that come out, that tell you every, minute detail about the book. Because sometimes I feel they kind of like when you learn the whole thing, you kind of might lose a little bit of the magic. But the Goodfellas book is that rare book where, if anything, it kind of enhanced my appreciation for that movie because that is probably the one of the most important movies to me because that's the movie that made me want to be a film critic.
no,
Uh,
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it was an important film to me. I met Martin Scorsese for the first time while he was editing the film, and one of the things we talked about was how excited he was for the movie's prospects, and his work definitely fulfilled that.
right. Well, so we're here to talk about a couple of things. People may not know this, but you're one of the few film critics whose early days began not as film criticism, but as a kind of a rock critic in some
Yeah, I
sense,
began as a music critic in the early to mid 80s. Yeah.
right?
I worked for Musician Magazine and the Village Voice, a little bit
Right.
for Spin here and there. Did some
And
ignominious work for Rolling Stone that I'm still reminded of because I gave a low rate star rating to a Tribe Called Quest album that was my unjustified and my bad, which I'm always apologizing for.
well,
But yeah, I was a music critic for some time.
just on a side note, was that their first album or was that Low End Theory? Which album was that?
No, the album it was Midnight Marauders. I really would rather not talk about it. I only brought it up as a matter of it's one of the things I'm most famous for, so to speak.
Right. Well, and you know, they always say never let a expert in the field watch a movie about that because they're just going to pick at it. Um, and so it's been in my journey that it's very tricky uh, when rock critics go into movie criticism because it's actually I feel it's two separate uh, skill sets, two
Yeah,
different skill sets. But you've been one of the few who've managed to kind of separate the two and know how to not use one to bash the other, as it were.
no,
Uh,
they're different processes for sure. So it is interesting, but I still like to write about music when I'm able.
right.
But
Well,
when,
well, the
when I
reason we're here
started,
is because Mean Streets turns 50 this year. I believe.
it
Believe it
does.
came out in October
Yeah,
uh, of 1973. So my
yeah.
first question, before we're here to talk about the soundtrack. Um, my first question, though, I guess I'll ask you. You were, if I know my chronology right, you'd have been 14. So do you remember the first time you saw Mean Streets?
It wasn't until a couple of well after it was released for the first time. I had a friend who saw it when it first came out, and I remember him describing the film to me very vividly, especially the opening sequence of the 8 millimeter films playing on a screen, accompanied by "Be My Baby," and he said, this was kind of for his moment. It was like when Sam Phillips first heard Howlin' Wolf and said, this is where the soul of man never dies. This was like a road to Damascus moment in terms of defining the kind of filmmaker he wanted to attach himself to. This is for me. That had a lot to do with his upbringing, my upbringing. We were both Italian American kids growing up on the outskirts of New York City, but very much aware of New York City. And there was something about the rhythm and the imagery and the volume of that really resonated with him.
Mm.
And when I got around to seeing it, it was a similar feeling. But I was about 14 or so, I
Okay.
guess.
Well,
Not quite old enough to get into R-rated movies by myself. I don't know why I didn't see it when it first came out, but it just the things fell that way.
right. Well, before we get to Mean Street, I guess we should talk about two things. One is that I guess we could give it a little context here, in that for a long time, I guess I think we would agree that Hollywood, they never really got or bothered to accept rock and roll, and they kind of just saw it as another way to make some quick money, because you had those Alan Freed movies in the 50s
Yeah.
where it's just put Go Johnny Go or
Yeah,
High School
this
Confidential.
is much longer conversation
Right,
than we're able to have. But yeah, I mean, the jukebox films of the 50s, mostly not even made by big Hollywood studios, but by
right,
smaller satellites of the Hollywood studios. The biggest one was, and actually the best is, of course, Girl Can't Help It,
right,
which is a weird, a very inventive, surreal, self-reflexive comedy directed by Frank Tashlin, who was an animator who applied
mhm,
animation type humor that originated with Tex Avery onto a live action film. And of course, having Jane Mansfield as the va-va-voom sex symbol special effect there. But in that film, it's also very notable that that film, the musical sequences are shot with a great deal of verve and respect. He didn't. You don't feel like he's being underhanded in his presentation of artists like Fats Domino, Little Richard, Abby Lincoln, prior to her becoming a jazz singer when she was a gospel R&B singer, Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent. They're all presented very respectfully, and that's a huge thing. And that film, I think, affected the Beatles certainly, and I'm sure it definitely had an effect on Scorsese himself. Um, I don't think what Scorsese was doing in his films was, trying to gain respect for rock and roll as such. He'll do in his films what's appropriate, and sometimes he'll lean, in his practice since Mean Streets, he'll lean on things, especially later in his career, a little harder, such as using "Gimme Shelter" a lot in his films. But in Mean Streets, what he wanted to reflect was not so much. I don't think he wanted to make a rock and roll film, but he wanted the music to be propulsive and intense, and to have something to say about the action on screen. And it also wanted to have a certain amount of verisimilitude, because he wanted the music to be what was being listened to in that environment. The environment of the bar where Harvey Keitel spends a lot of time and watches the go-go dancers. The jukebox, which has, is mostly rock and roll, but also has some, Italian pop stuff, Italian opera stuff in it. That kind of sneaks its way into Mean Streets.
right.
The biggest influence on the use of music, though, the thing that showed Scorsese the way when he talks about it, was maybe something we might consider unlikely, but it's definitely, because he's mentioned this, it's definitely the Kenneth Anger film Scorpio Rising.
Right. That was the other thing I was going to bring up. What I was getting at with the Hollywood point is that whenever a movie used rock and roll respectfully, it was always it was done kind of outside the system, like A Hard Day's Night and so forth. But
It was a
even when Hollywood was
British film by an American expatriate director.
right, and whenever but Hollywood never realized, they would they would never they never seemed to get the signal, like we could really do something with this music appropriately, and it just never really happened. And the Kenneth Anger
Well,
thing,
and eventually you get a different generation coming in charge of Hollywood. You talk
right,
about, you mentioned when we started to talk about having this discussion, and Jonathan Taplin, who was a producer of Mean Streets, who was a rock and roll guy. He's a
right,
road manager for some musical acts. So there's that coming into the mix as well. So Kenneth Anger's film Scorpio Rising, shot in the early '60s when Anger was hanging around with some rather possibly potentially brutal biker gangs in both the Bronx and Brooklyn, and then putting the footage together in a 25-minute film where he juxtaposes his sometimes frightening, often homoerotic imagery of these biker gangs with popular songs of the time, Party Nights, He's a Rebel, which he intercuts with very humorously with King of Kings, the Cecil B. DeMille Silent
Right.
King of Kings, the shots of Jesus leading his disciples, and intercut with a biker on his way to a party, and it's very it's kind of approaching the border of sacrilege for some viewers. Very interesting, very ironic, and this was not exactly needle drop stuff. And in fact, needle drop, as we know it, was not really a feature of Scorsese's use of music in Mean Streets.
Mm-hmm.
It's only when we get to later films that
Mm-hmm.
I think Mean Streets influenced the practice of needle drop, and then to a certain extent, Scorsese's practice could be seen as adopting the idea of needle drop in some pictures. If you look at Wolf of Wall Street, but it's fascinating, and there's a very high level of sophistication with which Scorsese uses the music. I teach in my class the scene where Harvey Keitel's character Charlie is sitting there watching the go-go dancer. They're playing the Stones' "Tell Me,"
Mm-hmm.
and then some Eric Clapton comes on the jukebox, and there's an issue involving their friend Johnny Boy, who owes he owes Michael a lot of money. Michael's his wannabe loan shark, and Charlie's saying, "Well, I'm going to take care of it for you," and he's thinking he's going to be able to go on with his evening unimpeded. But then Johnny Boy himself shows up with two young ladies in tow, and Johnny Boy in voiceover, although it's not Charlie in voiceover, although it's not Harvey Keitel's voice at this point, it's Scorsese's own voice, as a kind of autobiographical nod to where he's coming from with this project, where he says, "Well, thanks a lot, Lord. I talk about penance, and you send this through the door." And when De Niro comes in slow motion, you have Jumpin' Jack Flash on the soundtrack as a
Right.
kind of introduction to this character being a kind of a badass. And this is, it's playing on the jukebox, but he raises the volume so that it becomes not diegetic sound, but extra diegetic sound. And it kind of takes over the soundtrack for a few seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Then, because Johnny Boy is walking in slow motion, he mixes in the sounds of the bar, but they're slowed down to be commensurate with the pace in which the
Mm-hmm.
film is showing Johnny Boy walking, but the music remains at where it's at, so that's even more extra diegetic, and then it comes back down and becomes the music from the jukebox again as the dialogue mixes in.
Right.
And that's a level of sophistication and using the music to signal character, that
I
he
mean,
worked out at a very high technical level.
in Johnny Boy is the one character in the movie that gets two intros, basically,
Yeah.
because we see him early on in those quick intros where we get their
Yeah,
names.
that kind of those little sketches of the characters.
Right.
But this intro is more to do with Johnny Boy's relationship to Charlie. That's what
Mm-hmm.
it's that's what it's
Right.
kind of that's what it's signaling, the very tense and fraught and eventually tragic relationship.
Right. And you brought up Kenneth Anger. I wanted to bring that up because uh, the one scene that obviously it is an influence on Scorsese, and the one scene that you really can see it is the Blue Velvet sequence in Scorpio Rising, where the bikers are getting ready for the night,
Yeah,
and Scorsese obviously, in Mean Streets, we get one of the all-time great getting ready for the night sequences of Harvey Keitel getting ready, getting dressed for this coming home party for a
yeah,
veteran friend, done to the Chantels, "I Love You So,"
yeah.
which is very which
And then
obviously.
later on at that same party where he's completely wasted, we have the horrible, vertiginous version of Rubber Biscuit.
right, by the Chips,
Yeah,
right, and then uh, here's a question for you. The movie itself is the movie is autobiographical by Scorsese. He has said that it's basically like I think 5-7 years of his life compressed into 1 week. I think is what
yeah,
he has said. And so the movie is actually present day.
yeah.
It's not period. It's like so the movie came out in 1973.
Yeah,
So
it's
the
set in
movie is
19, yeah. I mean, he didn't make it a period film. He didn't
right,
have he couldn't make it, he had to make it a present day film. There were all sorts of things he had to do in
right,
order to get it made, because the spur from it came from after completing Boxcar Bertha, which was a project in which he had a certain amount of genuine, legitimate interest in terms of his historical story, but also, make films by any means necessary. He had to follow the directives of Roger Corman, put in a certain amount of nudity, et cetera, et cetera. And there's the famous story of John Cassavetes saying, "You just spent a year, or depending, you spent
making
2 years of your life making a piece of shit.
right,
It's a good picture, but it's not your picture. You have to make your picture." So he
right,
set about taking this material, which he had, drawn upon from his life in Who's That Knocking on My Door, his first feature to a certain extent, but taking that material again and reshaping it into this story, keeping it low, keeping it in a way that the script would be a low budget script that would not be
mhm,
demand a lot of resources. So one thing that you're not going to do in that situation is make a period film.
right.
And certainly it allowed him to use, contemporary music. I think there's that Eric Clapton song "Motherless Children" is in there in the scene I'm talking about, and that was a relatively recent song.
Well,
They were able to get all these
no,
songs for very.
it's I looked away.
I looked away, right? Derek and the Dominoes, right?
Right,
But
and
that was a relatively recent song.
right,
And I think this was before, paying outlandish fees for licensing became a thing. But it also helped that Taplin himself was an industry insider who could make personal pleas to certain artists to get the stuff cleared.
yeah. When I interviewed Taplin, I asked him. He said it was only a couple of $1,000
Yeah,
to get those songs. He says then he got them, and the only song that he told me a funny story. The only song he had to haggle over was "Jumping Jack Flash,"
right.
because I believe in the Albert Klein said, "Yeah, I'll do it, but I want approval of how it's used in the movie." That was in the contract, and
Yeah,
Taplin kind of stalled and stalled and stalled, trying to get that clause out of there. But then once the movie got picked up by a major, Warner Brothers, Klein's like, "Oh, okay, it's a major, so you can have the
yeah.
song." So
That was not, and that didn't that that idea of personal, approval didn't go away. That was how Paul Thomas Anderson had to get "Living Thing" by Electric Light Orchestra into Boogie
right,
Nights, and he was terrified. He sat there sweating bullets for 3 hours while
right.
Jeff Lynne watched the movie, because the song doesn't come up until the last minutes of the film.
Well, and here's the use of the song. Obviously, it's what I find fascinating. Maybe you can comment on this. Is that so? The movie is present day, but he's using songs that are well, not old, but they're about the majority of them are about maybe 10 years earlier. There's a few that
Yeah,
are a little later, but they're about 10 years earlier. Yet, if we were to be aware in 1973 what the musical landscape was, and if as we all saw in Almost Famous, it was quite different. Um, that music, the way it's presented in the movie and the way it sounds, it might as well be 100 years old. There's just this massive, um, I guess, kind of evolution that happened in music in
no,
that.
I hard disagree with you there. I mean, having been around at the time, I didn't go to a lot of bars at the age of 14, but you would, that kind of music was still always around. You always heard the Stones, you always heard Derek and the Dominoes, even when, the other things were coming up. It was a big mix of stuff. And in a bar like that, you would definitely, it's not a,
Mhm,
maybe he would have had a little more verisimilitude had he thrown in a Leonard Skinner song or something like that. But frankly, that music is perfect for that bar.
mhm. But not just about, but the other song I'm talking about, there's also the girl group songs. There's the
That's
vocals.
yeah. Well, that's done. The girl group song is those are all both extra diegetical. Those are
Mhm.
accompanying, or maybe it's when Charlie's getting ready for to go out, maybe he's playing it on his own stereo. I
Right,
mean, these are not guys. You look at the way they dress, you look at their haircuts. These are not guys who are who are going to be into acid rock. These
right.
are guys who are going to be into Led Zeppelin.
Mhm.
That's they would consider that sort of stuff to be for less manly folks than themselves. No, I think it's I think it's kind of spot on demographically.
Putting that aside, here's a quick. I did want to ask you this. This is just a movie question about Mean Streets, not dealing with music. In that, your read on the Johnny Boy character, and that he is clearly self-destructive to himself and to others, out of control, violent, and just an anarchist for anarchist's sake. But I'm wondering if you agree with some, and I tend to I find this a fascinating read, is that part of his craziness is basically a reaction to kind of the insular hypocrisy of his neighborhood.
I don't think he gives a shit. I mean, honestly, the way I mean, we can. That's an extrapolation. The relative, the way that Johnny Boy behaves relative to his environment, he doesn't give any indication of being someone who's who's particularly conscious of anything. And in fact, in as much as he's conscious of anything, he just delights in being contrary to it. We don't. His motivation is not eventually is neither here nor there. When he says at the end, I borrow money from everybody all over town, and I never have to pay it back, so I got to come to you because you're the only jerk off who'll lend me money. I mean, that's about as self-aware as he gets, and it's a
Mhm,
pretty it's a self-awareness that's just full of contempt. I mean, he just holds everyone in contempt. That's the thing about Johnny Boy. He just holds everyone in contempt. He has a good time with these guys, but he doesn't respect them. He doesn't hold them in any kind of esteem. Just the way he just lies and lies and lies and lies and lies, and that's all he does.
mhm.
um so ultimately what matters is where these actions take him, not what how did he get this way, because when you got a fucking bullet in your neck and you've got blood coming out of your artery and you're probably going to die. um
As I
what
guess
what can you do? Yeah.
here's my follow-up question, and to see how you take this point. Is Charlie, um, unknowingly or halfway knowingly, is he complicit in some of this? Because
Well, of course
uh,
it is. I mean by taking on the onus of it in the first place. I mean, whatever onus he takes on, we don't know how far back they go. We know mainly that their relationship has to do with his ties to Teresa, which are becoming increasingly frayed as time goes on anyway. So um there's a the whole point of Charlie's character is there are two things: his loyalty and his sense of morality. He's the only character in the movie who carries explicitly a sense of morality that you can see, because you hear him in his voiceover and he's talking about
mhm,
hell and he's talking about paying for your sins, and he's the only person of the four characters who takes that shit seriously.
right.
So and that is the thing that makes him stick around and vouch for Johnny Boy and try and help Johnny Boy.
Mhm.
But then when the extent to which he realizes he's gotten in too deep and then has to lam it, he starts, and then he becomes, that just opens the door for more tragedy. So, you know,
But
he
also
he had the
he
opportunity. He has several opportunities in the film to just say, "Well, fuck this guy." But
like,
and this speaks more to the point you were talking about the insularity of the neighborhood. This is more expressed in the character of Charlie than it is Johnny Boy, because he could say "fuck this guy," but where does that leave him? Where does he go? What does he do? Um,
Well, and also, he,
he has no exit.
right. Well, and but he's also a little, like I said, I question him a little. I mean, because of that insular neighborhood, at one point he asks the African American go-go dancer, can we meet? Because I'm thinking of opening a restaurant. I'd like for you to be a host. And then once he goes, he drives by, leaves her on the corner because of he's afraid someone in the neighborhood might see him with
He's a
a black woman.
he's a coward. He's essentially, he talks a good game about morality and conscience and
Right,
atoning for your sins, but when it comes down to it, he's a coward, which is the other reason that he can't, move forward. He's not going to open the restaurant story is a front. He just wants to date her. He doesn't have any. I mean, yeah, he has this option open to him in the form of his uncle Caesar Genova offering him, supervision of the restaurant that's owned by the poor guy who can't make his protection payments. But he's not going to take that up either. I mean, because he knows there's a sense in which he has enough sense to know that that in itself is, the worst dead end possible.
right.
But he's never going to break. He's too far invested in this environment. He'll never be able to break out the way that Scorsese himself did. Not to suggest that Scorsese ever had
But,
the proprietorship of a restaurant offered to him by a mobster uncle.
right.
Um,
Here's the last question on Mean Street, and we'll move on to the other topic. This movie came out the same year as American Graffiti.
that's right. Yeah, American Graffiti was a much bigger hit,
Much bigger
but they
hit.
both share in common. I'm sorry. I should let you complete your question. Yeah.
So in these movies, despite what people may say about George Lucas and all of that, in hindsight, these movies actually have a lot in common to a certain degree. Kind of these personal memory type films with the use of music. But I'm curious. I wanted you to comment. I was reading Pauline Kael's review of Mean Streets, and she talks about American Graffiti in the use of music. And this was a criticism, and it's a criticism I don't subscribe to, but it is a criticism. She says the music used, I'm paraphrasing, the music used in American Graffiti, those songs are our memory, where the songs in Mean Streets are Scorsese's memory. And it's two different uses of
Yeah, well, why is that a problem? I mean, American Graffiti is meant to be there's a very different intention
mhm.
in American Graffiti, the use of the music. And also, why are we talking about Pauline Kael? I mean, um why is she the Oracle of Delphi, where we have to like really weigh seriously every last pronouncement she ever made?
I'm going to here as an observation because it, while I don't agree with the criticism, it does point out the way these two movies that are similar, but the way they use their contrasting use of music.
you know
And they're
yeah,
both
because
and we both
and the use of music in American Graffiti is much more straightforward, much more, it's tied to a plot point where they're listening to the radio and they end up going to the radio station and talking to Wolfman Jack. There's nothing ironical about it. There's no there's no direct correspondence between between characterizations and the use of music. And again, you pointed it out yourself. Mean Streets isn't a period movie. It's not about memories.
Mhm.
The Eric Clapton song, the Derek and the Dominoes song was barely how many years old when it was used in that film.
probably like 2, 3. I mean,
Yeah, it's barely 2, 3 years old. Those memories of Derek and the Dominoes
right.
3 years ago. I mean, get the fuck out of here with
Uh,
this stuff. Excuse
well,
me.
well, well, here that's fine. It's fine. Well, because I only bring this up because, and this is like there's a little tangent for another conversation, but maybe you can put a bow on this because I do know we were talking earlier about the divide between rock criticism and film criticism, And I do know a few rock critics, a couple of rock historians, even who, one of the things, American Graffiti was more popular than Mean Streets at the time.
Yeah, but it was a sleeper hit. It didn't do
Right,
well. It didn't do great business right off the bat, but it
right.
eventually just got really, really
Would you
interesting.
agree, though, with my assertion that it is the use of, and this is the song I'm curious about, it, the opening with Rock Around the Clock. And yes, it had been a hit before in the 50s and with Blackboard Jungle, but it's that usage in American Graffiti that elevated that song to its kind of what the status of it is now. It's not
Well,
before.
American Graffiti is a very good movie,
Yes, it
and
is.
it's a very good movie that happened to inspire a really insipid sitcom called Happy Days that became extremely popular. And I think, if you don't, Happy Days had its own theme song, but its secondary theme song became Rock Around the Clock. And this was happening at a time in the 70s where, and these things spurred on a huge wave of nostalgia for late 50s, early 60s stuff. There was an oldie station, CBS FM, that became very, very, and WABC AM in New York. These stations, one was completely devoted to oldies. The others had like regular oldies hours with doo up and so on and so forth. And it was just sort of like, it was based on nostalgia. So American Graffiti, despite being a fairly bittersweet film, is not nearly as dark as Mean Streets. And so it is and I wouldn't say it's nostalgic as such, but it's definitely a receptacle for other it's an inspiration for other nostalgia type projects, whereas Mean Streets is not nostalgic. Again, it's not a period movie.
Mhm,
So, I think the main thing they have in common is to have these soundtracks that are packed with, you know, rock songs of a certain popularity.
mhm. Well, and moving on to the next film, because, and this is all coincidence, the reason I have you on here. So I had interviewed Jonathan Taplin to talk about Mean Streets soundtrack, and we had a more wide-ranging discussion, and we talked about The Last Waltz, and that was just gonna be part of the interview, but then literally less than a week after I did that interview, we had the
Yeah, sure.
sudden passing of Robbie Robertson. And so I wanted to bring on, that's why I brought you on to kind of talk about also the Last Waltz project as it is. Um, to set this up, as we all know, the Last Waltz farewell concert of the band with all their friends, as Robbie Robertson put it, on Thanksgiving 1976 at Winterland. Scorsese managed to got to film it while he was literally in the middle of shooting New York, New York.
Mhm.
And then he spent over a year, I guess, editing it, also doing the New York, New York edit and finishing that. And it didn't get released theatrically until uh, spring of 78, March, April of 78. So once again, I'll ask you the same question about Mean Streets, and then we can talk about the film real quick. Uh, I assume you saw this first run, The Last Waltz.
Yes, I did.
Okay. And before I ask you about that, um, I guess we should probably provide a little musical context in that the 18 months between the concert and then the film and the movie's release, I guess, is it safe to say the musical landscape had changed a little bit?
Yeah,
Since,
that was one reason I didn't quite get into it as much as I might have, because at the time it came out, I was a pretty heavy punk rock person,
right.
and that whole mode of music that was represented by the band and their compares seemed at the moment to have gotten really not stale, but definitely outmoded. But that was, that's proven wrong, because this music proves to be rather timeless.
Mhm,
Um, but I was certainly impressed with the craft, and I was, and it's come to be I think it's one of my favorite Scorsese films, and it's certainly my favorite Definitely my favorite concert film. I mean, people talk about Stop Making Sense, and Stop Making Sense is pretty great, but still think Last Waltz is better.
I got a couple questions about this. So, and you were into punk, and not only was punk exploding, but I mean, obviously the radio was all disco at that time, because Saturday Night Fever was, I
Yeah.
think, Christmas '77, so disco was just exploding.
I
Uh,
had no problem. I had no problem. I have to say, I had no problem with disco. I wasn't a follower of disco per se. I actually really like Chic because I like Nile Rodgers' guitar playing.
right.
And that was my way into disco if I ever got into disco. But I didn't mind disco, and I felt at the time, as I do now, that a lot of the criticisms or disdain that was expressed about disco were just, kind of like stealth, not even that stealth
Uh,
racism.
it's pretty racist and homophobic.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but a couple of questions about that little that era. Um, uh, Last Waltz. I mean, we'd had concert films before the Last Waltz, obviously, but is it safe to say what kind of distinguished Last Waltz then and even now? It's most concert films, even the great ones like Woodstock or Give Me Shelter or so forth. They're kind of shot as catch as catch can on the
Yeah.
fly, and here's the film that's literally as much as Scorsese could was mapped out visually.
Still a relative amount of catch as catch can. I mean, the
Right.
mapping out was done over, the course of a couple of weekends. It's
Mhm.
not, it's not a huge pre-production, but and Scorsese himself was kind of like roping in people who had been working with him on New York, New York, and it was a crazy, crazy time. And but yeah, they got the set direction from Boris Levin. He had these great camera operators, cinematographers doing the shooting. So, but it was put together in a whirlwind of activity that ultimately wasn't very good for Scorsese's health, for sure.
Right. And
And
I
it's
like
interesting when you look ahead several decades later to Shine a Light, which is when at the point which the whole prelude to Shine a Light are the pre-production arguments between the Stones and Scorsese as the Stones are on the road and he's sending them dioramas of a stage set and he's doing this and he's doing that. And it's very funny and people don't really get the not joke, but the observation that Scorsese is making in this scene is that, um unlike the Last Waltz, which was done in a kind of a maverick renegade style to a certain extent, now what they're doing in this concert film, they're doing as part of the establishment and with a lot of money.
right, right. Uh, you touched on this when we first brought up the Last Waltz, talking about the your initial kind of you know ambivalence about the film, and I'm wondering if you can maybe expand on that a little. And I'm not asking you to speak for others, but there is uh, I'm sure you're aware of there is that certain contingency in the rock critic world to this day who genuinely disdain the Last Waltz project, which and the film in particular, which I've always found odd because even if you don't like the film for whatever reason, particularly I guess I've always heard about they don't like I've always heard the complaint about the Neil Young cocaine thing and that the movie's basically
I mean, that people make a running joke out of that. Nobody who's worth taking seriously, though. I mean, if you unless you can cite someone who's actually worth taking seriously talking about this stuff, I can't really comment on it. I mean, you know,
my 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 own
whoever,
my retort to all is okay. Let's say you just don't like the movie, fine. But if I was to hand this person, if I was to hand you the Last Waltz soundtrack, just the soundtrack, is listen to this.
yeah.
How are you? I don't understand the complaint of it's not that good.
Yeah, well, Bob Christgau didn't like the movie too much because he felt like that Robbie Robertson in particular comes off as smug, and that's I think eye of the beholder stuff. Um, Robertson has a certain kind of demeanor, and he's definitely the most camera ready
Right.
of the guys in the band. I mean, I guess Levon comes in a close second, but only when he's performing. Levon, when he's being interviewed, is not that compelling. Um, but that's just sort of how it all went down. We know now that Robertson's decision to break up the band was not enthusiastically shared by the other members of the band. So their reticence while on camera can be put down to that to a certain extent, and also put down to whatever self-medicated condition they may have been on camera. But for Robertson, he was ready to perform for both the interview segments and the concerts and the recreations, and they were ready to perform musically as well. So it is what it is. But
well, and if you want to talk about,
I think to sort of go back and especially relative to Helm's objections to the film. Oh, Neil Diamond was only there because Robbie Robertson had produced his latest album. Well, yeah, maybe so. So what?
it's a good
Levon
song.
Helm was the band's leader until Robbie Robertson sort of took that mantle from him just by being present enough to supervise the making of the records and oversee the writing of the songs, and that did not sit well with him. But we don't have to take the internecine problems of the band and attach them to this particular work as part of an agenda.
Right.
The work is the work.
Right.
Movie is the movie.
And then
you can't hang with it because of your Levon Helm loyalty. That's your problem.
well, and also, and if we want to talk about the smugness of rock stars in the 70s, I think Robbie Robertson probably rates pretty low if you want to talk about, like, I don't know, Don Henley and Glenn Frey at the same time,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely relative to Don Henley for sure. So,
so I mean, Robert Robertson, he just seems a little, he's downright cordial compared to,
yeah,
to Don Henley.
it's a good movie. It's a good movie. It's a great movie.
It's a
So,
great movie. It's on my, it's on my, the pandemic, you get a lot of downtime. And so I think I told you once I sat down for a couple of days and I decided to create my top 10 lists of every year since I was born. So since 78. And Last Waltz, I think, is number 3 or 4, 78.
yeah, it's
Uh,
fantastic.
so to bring this to the present, and so that ends, and then basically this what I guess it'll be a 45-year partnership that Scorsese and Robertson had as his music supervisor.
I think calling it apart. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a consistent
Right. I mean, he didn't
thing.
do every
So
film,
it wasn't like and honestly, after bringing his solo career more or less to a close, Robertson didn't do a lot of traveling. He kind of kept to his beautiful home in California, and so I don't think him and Scorsese saw that much of each other in person for very long periods. They didn't hang the way they did after the Last Waltz, where they got a house together and had that whole too much talked about lost weekend period.
right.
But they maintained a consistent, friendship and dialogue for sure.
Right.
And but Robbie was, Robertson was. My sense of Robertson is that not that he had to be pushed into things, but all things being equal, he wasn't hungrily pursuing the work that he got from Scorsese. I think Scorsese was the guy who pursued him.
Right. Before I ask you about the work he did do, real quick, do you have any comments or memories, or maybe I don't even know if you've seen it? 'Cause I've always heard about the movie. I've never seen it, but I didn't know he was connected to it until his passing. I read about it, and that's the movie Carney.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, he's very good in that film. That's an underrated picture. The film where Gary Busey and Robbie Robertson play carnival workers, carnies, and they both fall in love with a young carnival worker played by Jodie Foster. Gary Busey is the Dunk-a-Clown guy, he's very harsh and acerbic, and Robbie Robertson's character is a little more reserved and a little more hunky and ultry sultry. And it's these two guys and they're best friends, and their shared lust for Jodie Foster comes between them. And Robertson gave a very creditable performance. I think he decided, he never. I haven't read his book Testimony, and I don't think it's covered in that book. But I think at a certain point, this wasn't for him. And he'd rather make records and then not make records. I mean, when he got off the road, he got off the road. And when the band got back on the road without him in 1982, 83, what followed in the years after that was relatively disastrous. Richard Manuel's suicide, Rick Danko's drinking himself to death. And Robertson said, I broke up this band for a reason.
Mhm.
Now these two guys are dead, so now you know what the reason is. When he got off the road, he got off the road.
Yeah.
And maybe to him, film acting was another version of being on the road. It's very tedious. There's a lot of waiting. And he was well off enough that
And
he didn't have to
well,
do that kind of work if he didn't want to.
and the thing the thing he did with Scorsese, he would, like I said, he didn't do every one of them, but he did put together some of the, I guess he executive produced some of these soundtracks.
Yeah.
The one that I've always, I mean, obviously we can all talk about Goodfellas and Casino soundtracks till we're blue in the face, and they're great.
And Robertson had nothing to do with the soundtrack of Goodfellas.
Right. Okay.
I don't
The
think.
casino one, I believe.
Yeah.
But the soundtrack of his that I like, that is underrated, and I wish someone would remaster it and put it out properly, is his Color of Money soundtrack.
Yeah, that was one where, and again, this was something that they could collaborate in. It wasn't just Robertson's taste that Scorsese counts on when he's using Robertson as a consultant. It's his connections.
Right.
And the thing about Color of Money that was unique was that there were a certain amount of jukebox songs used in there. I think a little Willie John song, and then there was, of course, the famous Werewolf of London. But then
And Eric Clapton.
they had
Also,
constructed the Clapton stuff was made specifically for the film, and
Right.
this was a deal that Scorsese had constructed, probably with Robertson's help, that allowed him to commission these songs and ask for them to be made along specific lines. And he talks about it in Scorsese on Scorsese, the song "It's in the Way That You Use It," and going back and forth with Clapton about the lyrics, thinking one of them is a little too on the nose and can you bring it down a little bit, and so on. And this was to him at the time a very exciting thing, because you could do a thing whereas instead of relying on already existing songs, you could craft songs by guys who were proven legitimate rock singer-songwriters and make a whole soundtrack out of that. And that seemed to be at the time a new horizon, which was not really subsequently too followed up on
no,
by Scorsese. In the films after that, he either went back to the standard of using the songs in his own personal jukebox brain, or using scores for, in this case of Cape Fear, and whatchamacallit, Age of Innocence, using scores by Elmer Bernstein, and and then falling back to Robertson as consultant. And two most prominent films where we have that would be the most recent films, The Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon, both films for which Robertson not only consulted but also contributed original music that's very evocative. I haven't seen Killers of the Flower Moon, but of course that whole theme from The Irishman is something that Robertson cooked up in the studio.
did Robertson consult on the Wolf of Wall Street soundtrack?
No, I don't think he did, but there's a way to find out. Yeah,
Right.
no, that's a weird soundtrack. Everybody was kind of like, what's Foo Fighters doing in here?
Well, that's a soundtrack, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, but I'll just say this.
Actually, he did do so. He did work. Yeah, he did the Money Chant and a few other things. I'm not sure the extent. He kind of but in terms of actually assembling the soundtrack, he worked, the music consultant was Randall Poster, the very well known
Yes,
music consultant. Um, but he definitely
that's just
instead of consulting directly with Scorsese, he worked with Randall Poster and he did some music in the film itself.
that's a soundtrack that intellectually I understand what is at play with that, the use of that music uh for that movie, but I I I just I don't know, this is maybe I'm just not evolved enough yet as a movie critic. I just kind of wish that he had kind of done what a little more the harder stuff of what those guys really would have been listening to.
I don't think he cares. Frankly,
Right.
he didn't want to make that movie in the first place. He mainly made it because there was so
Like,
much money pushed to his side of the table that he couldn't. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. And when he takes on these films, um, as he said, and he was very blunt about this when I moderated a press conference with him about it. I didn't want to have anything to do with this guy. I didn't want to have anything to do with this. I had to come to him my own way. That's how he does all the projects. That's what people do. I read a review recently by a very well-regarded film critic talking about The Aviator and how it's a disgrace that Scorsese didn't reveal Howard Hughes for the horrible person he was. It's like, that's nice. It's not how he's going to do the work. He's going to do the work the way he wants to do the work, or he's not going to do it at all. And if he wants to create this fiction of Howard Hughes that you feel is a shameful, betrayal of the actual reality, he's going to do that, and you can like it or lump it. The film is about something else than your idea of Howard Hughes. It's about his. It's not even about his idea of Howard Hughes.
mhm.
So same with Wolf of Wall Street. It's not even about his idea. It's about his
Well,
idea of Justin Belfort, and it's not like, well, I want to be true to what these guys were actually listening to. There's a fair amount of stuff that they would have been listening to in there, but for him, it's all about creating propulsion, especially
well,
in that film, and it's almost farcical too. That's the thing. Wolf of Wall Street is his most farcical film.
well, yeah,
So
that is true. I've my thing about Wolf of Wall Street, that is to me just like Oliver Stone's Any Given Sunday. Oliver Stone's Any Given Sunday is Stone dealing with the reckoning with the legacy of Scarface, where to me Wolf of Wall Street is Scorsese at a certain level dealing with the legacy of Goodfellas to a certain extent.
yeah, maybe. I mean, to a certain extent, that's an interesting reading. I wouldn't discount it, but I mean, I'm sure that to a certain extent, he's looking at these gangsters now who are working on the ostensibly in legitimate business.
Mhm.
So there is a kind of flip side to it, to be sure. And
Right.
also the fact that they're behaving in ways that have been influenced by that film. So
Yeah, that these are the I think that's what I think that's one of the entry points. I wanted to fascinate him that these are the guys who they grew up, watching Goodfellas over and over
yeah,
and over again and trying to apply that to
their
to their
own sad and miserable lives and make them not sad and miserable anymore.
right.
Them
And
full of excitement again.
right. Well, and the real to me that one of the real echoes, or I guess you could say, where the movie comments on Goodfellas, we get that shot of Kyle Chandler,
Yeah,
after all is
on
said and
the
done.
F train. That's my train. So yeah, I feel it.
Yeah, and we go back that echoes Ray Liotta, line of
Hmm.
dialogue where he says
No,
those guys with those goody good paychecks,
yeah,
working bum jobs, they were suckers, they were losers.
yeah.
You know.
There you go.
Well, I'll ask you this last question, then I'll let you go because I kept it so long. So, here like I said, it's 50 years on. It is it this is a grandiose statement, but I stand by it. But I mean, you can argue with me on it if you want. It seems to me that Scorsese, with Mean Streets and ever since, he's the one that has really kind of set a bar. And I'm not articulating this too well, but when it comes to the way uh, filmmakers showing filmmakers how you can use pop music uh, in a film. It had been done before, obviously, many, 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 many times, but his is kind of the one that everyone seems to try to emulate.
Yeah,
he's
and I
come up
mean,
with it.
I think it's, like I said, it's led to, and Scorsese himself deplores this. I think Scorsese deplores the needle drop as such, but there is a sense in which the film like Mean Street kind of forged the way for the needle drop to come into existence. But I think that's actually probably more true of American Graffiti when you come down to it, if we're going to compare those two films.
Mhm. Well, and just on a trivial question, I'll ask you this as a rock critic slash movie critic. Your favorite Scorsese soundtrack?
I guess I'd have to say Goodfellas. I mean, that's the one I teach. I teach the arrest day scene and how he sort of makes a suite out of these, dozen or more rock and roll and blues songs that has this kind of frantic through line of what's going on in this poor guy's head and his day as he's moving along. And it's both in terms of the effect, especially when he slams on the brake when while Magic Bus goes into the frenetic drum break. It's so perfectly calibrated, and when you're watching it on a great sound system, the emotional effect of it is absolutely exactly what he wanted it to be. So and the blue sky with Muddy Waters singing, it's just perfect. So I'd
Yeah.
have to say that.
Well, and then the way he uses the version of Memo from Turner.
Yeah.
Because there's two versions of that song, but the one that he chooses.
So he uses the right version. The
Right.
version of Metamorphosis is bad. The version on the actual soundtrack to Performance is good, and that's the one he uses.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Glenn, I want to thank
He,
you for
he
this.
knows his stuff. He knows he knows the distinction. He's
Sure.
not going, that's the thing. He's not going to, make a compromise. Not that he
Mhm.
had to, but he just knew the version that he wanted, and it was the right one.
Right.
So that legitimizes his entire career.
Yeah. Well, along with many other things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. I hope you stay well.
I'm hanging. I'm doing my best to hang in there. Give my best
All
to
right.
Claire.
All right, you bet.
I'll talk to you soon.
So long.